In 1786, at the age of 31, French painter Élisabeth Louise Vigée LeBrun caused a scandal in the Paris Salon with this beautiful self-portrait of herself and her daughter. What was so shocking about this lovely rendering of maternal joy? Élisabeth Louise Vigée was born on April 16, 1755, to mother Jeanne Mycin, a hairdresser, and father Louis Vigée, a portraitist. Very little of her childhood was spent at home with her parents. From age 6 to 11, Elizabeth lived at a convent where she learned to read and write and where she drew incessantly in the margins of her school books. In the time she was able to spend at home, her father encouraged her passion and allowed her the use of his supplies for practice. Louis Vigée died when Elizabeth was 12. This may have cut the artistic education of a different young girl short, but Elizabeth's continued training was assisted by her father's friends, who recognized her skills. Although she was unable to formally apprentice due to her gender, Elizabeth was still able to gain valuable instruction with their assistance. She was financially supporting her mother and younger brother with commissions earned from painting by the time she was 15. Her mother remarried shortly after her father's death, and Vigée LeBrun described her stepfather as a miserly man in her memoirs. She wrote, "He displays his stinginess by limiting us to the absolute necessities of life, although I was good-natured enough to hand over everything I earned." At the age of 19, Élisabeth Vigée became a master in the Academy of St. Luc, even despite no formal training as an apprentice. She had been painting members of the French aristocracy and visiting aristocrats for years by this point. When she was 21 in 1776, Elizabeth's mother pressured her to marry. Her husband was to be Jean-Baptiste Pierre Lebrun, an art dealer who shared the same lodgings as Elizabeth's family. She was not happy about the entire ordeal and recalls in her memoir, "So small, however, was my enthusiasm to give up my freedom that on the way to church I kept saying to myself, 'Shall I say yes? Shall I say no?' Alas, I said yes, and changed my old troubles for new ones." It wasn't long after the wedding that Vigée LeBrun learned her new husband had a passion for gambling. She would unfortunately be required to support his habit for the rest of his life. Her new troubles were essentially the same as her old. She herself did not benefit much from the fruits of her own labor, as first her stepfather and then her husband immediately relieved her of them. Vigée LeBrun would give birth to her only child, daughter Jeanne Julie Louise, in February 1780. It's probably not a stretch to assume that Julie was the light of Vigée LeBrun's life. She depicted herself smiling warmly in the self-portraits she painted, which included her daughter. This one, titled Self-Portrait with Her Daughter, Julie, was painted in 1786. It caused quite a little scandal at the Paris Salon in 1787. Vigée LeBrun had cast off the solemn regalia of centuries of tradition, had trodden underfoot the very dignity and respectability of the medium, had haughtily and shamelessly turned her back on the labor and skill of all those who came before her. Élisabeth Louise Vigée LeBrun had the utter audacity to paint herself smiling. This wasn't the first portrait she had painted in such a scandalous manner. Her teeth are visible in this one, too. Portraits like these that look very solemn and respectable to the modern eye were extremely avant-garde in Vigée LeBrun's time. Before the 18th century, portraiture typically depicted the subject standing or sitting, stiffly and somewhat unnaturally as a means of conveying dignity and decorum. Vigée LeBrun did not subscribe to this particular method, instead choosing to depict her sitters in more natural poses. Many of her portraits feel almost like snapshots, which is quite a feat considering photographic portraits didn't exist in her time and wouldn't be available at all until later in the 19th century. She painted over 600 portraits in her long life, and her incredible portfolio has been influencing the artistic style and expression of Western artists for almost 200 years now. Vigée LeBrun met Marie Antoinette for the first time in 1779 when she was 24. In her memoirs, she describes the meeting as accidental, as she and her mother were taking a walk in a park and happened to cross paths with the Queen and her ladies-in-waiting. It wasn't long afterward that Vigée LeBrun painted the first of many royal portraits of the young Queen. The two women were the same age, both born in 1755. The Academy of St. Luke, the collection of city guilds that governed and oversaw the sale of paintings and other artwork, typically allowed women to join with little or no problem, as was the case with Vigée LeBrun when she joined at age 19. The much more prestigious Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture was a different story. According to Wikipedia, this institution included most of the important painters and sculptors in France, maintained almost total control of teaching and exhibitions, and afforded its members preference in royal commissions. Vigée LeBrun was already the favorite painter of Queen Marie Antoinette, and didn't necessarily need membership in this illustrious organization to make good connections, but membership would have absolutely been a glowing recommendation on her resume. This was especially true as, unlike the Guild of St. Luke, the Royal Academy was very picky about the women it allowed to join. In the 145 years between 1648 and 1793, only 15 women were accepted as members. Vigée LeBrun was initially disqualified from entry due to her husband's occupation as a picture dealer. However, pressure from Louis XVI, interceding on behalf of his wife's favorite portraitist, created an exception. Although she was primarily a portraitist, Vigée LeBrun submitted an allegorical painting as her entry piece into the Academy titled Peace Bringing Back Abundance. For some reason, this made it difficult for the Academy to place her neatly into a genre box such as history, the most prestigious of genres, or portraiture, and Vigée LeBrun received no classification at all, which no doubt suited her just fine. Vigée LeBrun's preferred clothing for herself was plain muslin gowns, dressed up with sashes and scarves. She would often encourage her sitters to adopt a similar mode to create a sense of timeless simplicity in her portraits. She also disliked powdered hair and asked her aristocratic sitters to appear without it. She was such a fan of simple clothing that she was the source of yet another scandal, this time in the form of her 1783 portrait of Marie Antoinette, wearing a simple white smock. This portrait was ostensibly to bolster the Queen's plunging popularity and help her to seem more relatable, but it entirely missed the mark. Marie Antoinette would never be able to shed the unforgivable sin of being a foreigner in the French court. The simple portrait only provided new fuel for criticism and was so scandalous that it was eventually replaced with this one. Vigée LeBrun and her family traveled to Belgium and the Netherlands in 1781, where she saw Paul Rubens' portrait titled, in English, The Straw Hat. Rubens' portrait was the inspiration for this painting, completed the following year in 1782. The nods to Rubens' work in Vigée LeBrun's self-portrait are pretty easy to spot. The blue sky and gray clouds behind the figure, the luxurious wrap encircling the figure's shoulders, the extravagant feathers, and, of course, the hat. The technique of combining both direct and reflected light is what drew Vigée LeBrun to this work and inspired her own version. The face of each woman is shaded by the brim of her large hat, but is still gently lit with reflected light. The differences between the two paintings are also easily apparent. Vigée LeBrun gazes out at the viewer with an open, direct, warm expression, her lips parted in a small smile. By contrast, the gaze of Rubens' model, Susanna London, is focused off to one side, and she has crossed her arms defensively in front of her. Vigée LeBrun looks relaxed and comfortable. London looks self-conscious and discomfited. This self-portrait is pretty sizable at 97.8 centimeters by 70.5 centimeters, or 38 inches by 27.7 inches. For my fellow Americans, that's just a hair over 3 feet high by 2 feet wide. The artist did 2 copies of this painting. The original is in the private collection of Edmund de Rothschild, and the second version, which I'm using to paint this master study, is in the National Gallery in London. Vigée LeBrun was 34 in October 1789 when the royal family was arrested. As a well-known associate of the Queen, she was forced to flee to Italy. She took her daughter with her and left her husband behind. She wrote in her memoirs, "I had left my principal effects and my jewels in Paris, and the fruit of my labors was in the hands of my husband, who spent it all. I lived abroad solely on the proceeds of my painting." Once in Italy, she set up a studio and began painting portraits to support herself and her daughter. Her skill and fame meant that it wasn't long before she was being patronized by the Italian aristocracy, and she was soon once again making advantageous connections and rubbing elbows with the rich and powerful. While in Italy, she lived mainly in Rome and Naples, though she traveled frequently to Florence, Turin, and Venice. She used her time in the country to study the plethora of Italian masterpieces available for her viewing. Marie Antoinette was executed in October 1793. During my research, I have read that, due to their wildly different social statuses, it was impossible for anything like a friendship to exist between Vigée LeBrun and the Queen. But I find it very difficult to believe that the regard the two clearly had for one another could be anything except friendship. Vigée LeBrun painted over 30 portraits of Marie Antoinette and her family before the Revolution. That's a lot of hours of sitting together. Vigée LeBrun is described by multiple sources as a lively conversationalist, and Marie Antoinette was an Austrian national greatly disliked by the French people for many things she had no control over. Her only quote-unquote job in the French court was to be the mother of Louis XVI's children. The two were so comfortable in one another's company there is record of them singing duets while Vigée LeBrun painted. They were the same age, they were both mothers, and they had each lost a child. Vigée LeBrun's second final pregnancy ended in miscarriage in 1784. She recounts an event in her memoirs in which she was so ill on a day she was scheduled to paint the Queen she was unable to keep the appointment. The day after, she hurried to the palace to make her apologies. She describes Marie Antoinette's graciousness and compassion, and how the Queen instantly changed her current plans to sit for Vigée LeBrun instead. I remember that, in my confusion and my eagerness to make a fitting response to her kind words, I opened my paint box so excitedly that I spilled my brushes on the floor. I stooped down to pick them up. Never mind, said the Queen, and, for aught I could say, she insisted on gathering them all up herself. If these two women weren't friends, then I would love to know how the historians making that claim define friendship. Also, in 1793, 4 years into Vigée LeBrun's exile, her husband put together a petition to allow her to return to France, but his petition was denied. Shortly after that, he was imprisoned, along with Vigée LeBrun's brother Etienne, for several months, thanks to their familial ties. In 1794, he divorced her for his own safety and to recover his assets, many of which had been seized at the beginning of the Revolution because of their marital status. Meanwhile, Vigée LeBrun and her daughter had made their way to Austria and settled in Vienna. There, she continued to schmooze with the aristocracy and build new social connections. This is what would eventually lead her to relocate to the court of Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg in 1795. Catherine had granted asylum to many French exiles, and French culture was admired so thoroughly in her court that the French language was what was spoken there rather than Russian. Vigée LeBrun found a very warm welcome in St. Petersburg, and the society there was so agreeable to her that she remained for 6 years through the end of her self-imposed exile. While in Russia, a rift developed between Vigée LeBrun and her daughter. Now a teenager, Julie had taken a fancy to a man her mother disapproved of. She married against Vigée LeBrun's wishes, but with her father's blessing via correspondence, and remained in Russia when Vigée LeBrun left to return to France in 1800. It's probably not a stretch to guess that Vigée LeBrun could recognize a bad egg when she saw one, given her mother's marriage to one and her own marriage to another. And her disapproval was merited, as Julie's marriage did not last long. The damage to the mother-daughter relationship was longer lasting, sadly, and the two would not see each other again for many years. Even after the divorce, Jean-Baptiste, along with Vigée LeBrun's other family, had continued to petition for her pardon and safety so that she could come back to Paris. He was finally successful in 1800, and 2 years after that, Vigée LeBrun returned home in 1802. She had spent 12 years from age 35 to 47 in exile. Maybe a little surprisingly, considering societal opinion when she fled, Vigée LeBrun received a warm welcome at her homecoming. She remained in Paris for less than a year, however, as she was not a fan of life under the Napoleonic court, so she left Paris once more and journeyed to England. Her fame preceded her north to London, where she would spend the next 2 years. After London, she spent some time in Geneva, but eventually returned more permanently to France. She purchased a house in the country and divided her time between her home in Louveciennes and Paris. Vigée LeBrun's ex-husband, her lifelong financial drain, died in 1813. This was the first in an unfortunate series of deaths. Her daughter, Julie, died a few years later from illness in 1819 at the age of 39, and her brother Etienne just a year later in 1820. Vigée LeBrun died in Paris on March 30th, 1842, at the age of 86. Although she had enjoyed unprecedented success as an artist during her lifetime, she faded somewhat into obscurity after her death. In the years between her death and the 1970s, her portraits were only significant to art historians because of the identity of the subjects. It's only recently, since the rise of feminism beginning in the 60s and 70s, that an interest in women artists has returned to her some of the notoriety she enjoyed in life. Known primarily as a portraitist of women, Vigée LeBrun actually painted a fairly equal number of male portraiture. Modern historians have noted a distinct difference in the presentation of her male subjects versus the women. Whereas the men she painted are described as assertive and intelligent, the women are described as soft, placid, and sometimes vapid. She has received some modern criticism for this, which seems a little odd to me considering her job. As an artist who was hoping to be paid for her work, part of her work involved flattering her subject, and her male and female sitters would, naturally, have different ideas about what was flattering. This really does illustrate that it's impossible to please everyone. Vigée LeBrun's critics claim her renderings of her female sitters are too flattering to be realistic, while Mary Cassatt's critics complained the opposite, that her renderings were too realistic to be flattering. What matters in the end is that both the artist and her subject were happy with the results. Speaking of being happy with the results, I felt fairly confident going into this that I'd do all right, and walking out on the other end, I do indeed feel like I did all right. The trickiest parts of making this painting were rendering the contrast in the white ruffle on the neckline and rendering the face. My faces still need a lot of work, but I feel like I'm seeing some improvement as I keep making new paintings. Working at a larger scale might help, as having a little more room to navigate details would probably make things easier too, but since I'm limited on supplies and space right now, I'll continue to make do with the supplies I have. Thank you for joining me on my little adventure through the life of yet another incredible woman artist. If you enjoyed this video, I have a handful of others ready for viewing and have plans for a lot more. I'll be back again in a couple of weeks with another artist from the Low Countries, Dutch master Judith Leyster. I hope to see you then.